Between October 14th and 16th, 1991, 13 government officials were drowned across the farmlands of Marathon County, Wisconsin. All adults, all employed by federal or state regulatory agencies. The method was systematic, using farm equipment and water sources, manure lagoons, grain silos filled with irrigation water, milk cooling tanks, drainage ponds. The perpetrator was Robert Dutch Vandermeer, a 47-year-old, third-generation dairy farmer who'd never had so much as a speeding ticket. The Marathon County Sheriff's Department would later call it the most calculated series of eliminations in Wisconsin's agricultural history. But the motive wasn't a blood feud, wasn't mental illness, wasn't even a dispute over money. It was 13 pieces of paper, 13 violation notices that threatened to shut down the dairy farm Dutch's grandfather had carved from virgin timber in 1923. And one man's unshakable belief that protecting 3 generations of family legacy justified any cost, even if that cost was measured in human lives. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Marathon County, Wisconsin, sprawled across 1,544 square miles of glacially formed land in the central part of the state in 1991. The terrain rolled gently, unlike the dramatic peaks out west, covered in a patchwork of dairy farms, woodlots of maple and oak, and small towns where everyone knew your name, your business, and your grandfather's sins. Population hovered around 115,000, with most folks concentrated in Wausau, the county seat. But the real Marathon County existed in the spaces between towns, in the unincorporated townships with names like Rietbrock, Hamburg, and Knowlton, where dairy farms sat on 40, 80, sometimes 250 acres, connected by county roads that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter. October in central Wisconsin meant temperatures dropping to the mid-30s at night, climbing to maybe 55 by afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like silage, that sweet, sour, fermented corn that filled silos for winter feed, mixed with the ever-present scent of manure and the sharp bite of coming winter. Morning fog rolled across pastures so thick you couldn't see the neighbor's barn a quarter mile away. The sound of the place was Holstein cows, lowing in the pre-dawn darkness, diesel tractors grinding through their work, and the rhythmic pulse of milking machines that ran twice daily, every day, without exception. But 1991 was a devastating year for Wisconsin dairy farmers. The industry that had defined the state's identity for over a century was collapsing under the weight of modernization, regulation, and economic forces that treated family farms like obsolete machinery. In 1980, Wisconsin had 42,000 dairy farms. By 1991, that number had dropped to 28,000. Farms weren't just shrinking in number. They were dying, foreclosed, auctioned off to corporate operations, or land developers who carved pastures into subdivisions. The survivors faced impossible choices. Get bigger, invest hundreds of thousands in new equipment and facilities, or get out. There was no middle ground anymore. The federal government had introduced new regulations in 1990 under the updated provisions of the Clean Water Act and expanded USDA facility standards. On paper, the regulations made sense. Prevent manure, runoff into waterways, ensure milk safety, maintain animal welfare standards. But the reality for small family operations was different. Compliance meant concrete manure, storage facilities costing $50,000, new milking parlors with updated cooling systems, another $75,000, renovated barns meeting the latest animal housing requirements, easily $100,000 more. For operations milking 50, 70, even 150 cows, those numbers were impossible. The math didn't work. Milk prices hadn't risen significantly in a decade, hovering around $12 per hundredweight while costs climbed steadily. Feed, fuel, veterinary care, equipment repairs, everything cost more. Labor was harder to find. Young people left for cities, for college, for anything that didn't involve waking at 3:30 a.m. to milk cows in sub-zero temperatures. The average dairy farmer in Marathon County in 1991 was 56 years old, one generation away from extinction. And the inspectors came like a biblical plague. USDA officials checking tank temperatures, testing milk samples, scrutinizing every aspect of milking procedures. Environmental regulators measuring manure storage capacity, testing runoff, citing violations for nitrogen levels in drainage ditches. Health department inspectors examining barn cleanliness, counting flies, photographing conditions that had been acceptable for 70 years but now violated codes written by people who'd never milked a cow. Each inspection brought paperwork. Each violation brought fines, deadlines, mandatory corrective actions. For farmers already operating on razor-thin margins, already working 80-hour weeks, already watching their children leave for easier lives, the regulatory pressure felt less like reasonable oversight and more like a deliberate campaign to destroy them. Robert Vandermeer had been called Dutch since childhood, a nickname inherited from his grandfather, also Robert, also called Dutch, who'd emigrated from the Netherlands in 1907 at age 16 with nothing but a wool coat and a work ethic that bordered on religious fervor. Dutch stood 6 feet tall, lean, and corded, with muscle built from decades of physical labor that machines couldn't replace. His face was weathered like old barn wood, deeply lined around the eyes from squinting into sun and snow, a permanent furrow between his brows from worry and calculation. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen from old breaks that had never set quite right, calluses thick as boot leather from handling everything from barbed wire to newborn calves. A scar ran across his left forearm where a cow had kicked him into a fence post in 1983, requiring 17 stitches he'd gotten only after finishing the evening milking. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the damage, the arthritis beginning to settle in joints worked too hard for too long. Dutch woke every morning at 3:30 a.m., had done so since he was 12 years old. Over 35 years of pre-dawn risings that had become as automatic as breathing. He'd make coffee in the same percolator his grandmother had used, so strong it could strip paint, drink 1 cup standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn, and be out the door by 3:45. The milking parlor waited, 180 Holstein cows needing to be milked, fed, and cared for before most people hit their snooze buttons. He'd married Ellen Louise Hoffman in 1970, right after she graduated from Wausau East High School. They'd had 3 children, Robert Jr., called Bobby, who was 20 now, away at UW-Madison studying business, trying to escape the farm. Sarah was 17, a senior at Wausau East, brilliant with numbers, already accepted to Marquette University. Tommy was 14, the only one who seemed to love farming, who woke early on weekends to help, who talked about taking over someday. Ellen was 45, her hands as work-worn as Dutch's, her face still beautiful, despite everything the farm had demanded from her. What Dutch valued most wasn't money, though he'd never had much of that. What he valued was continuation. His grandfather had walked onto this land in 1923 with borrowed money and a dream. The first inspection notice arrived on March 7, 1990. A standard letter from the USDA informing Dutch that his facility had been selected for a comprehensive review under the updated dairy farm regulations. The inspection would cover milk handling procedures, animal welfare conditions, and equipment maintenance. Please be available on March 21st at 9 a.m. Dutch had read the letter twice, standing in the kitchen while his coffee went cold, feeling something tighten in his chest. His grandfather's farm had passed every inspection for 67 years. His father had run a clean operation, and Dutch had maintained those standards. But he knew, from talking to other farmers at the feed mill, at church, at the monthly dairy association meetings, that these new inspections were different. They weren't looking to verify compliance. They were looking for violations. Gerald Hawkins arrived exactly on time, March 21st, 9 a.m., driving a white government sedan that looked absurdly clean against the mud of the farmyard. He was 34 years old, young for his position, wearing slacks and a polo shirt with the USDA logo, carrying a clipboard and a camera. Dutch met him at the barn door, shook his hand, tried to read the man's face. Hawkins was polite, professional, but there was a distance there, a detachment that made Dutch uneasy. This wasn't a man who understood farming. This was a man checking boxes. The inspection took 4 hours. Hawkins photographed everything: the milking parlor, the bulk tank, the feed storage, the calf pens, the manure storage lagoon. He took temperature readings, collected milk samples, measured distances between equipment and walls. He asked questions about cleaning procedures, maintenance schedules, veterinary records. Dutch answered honestly, showed him the logbooks his father had started in 1956. The meticulous records the Vandermeer family had always kept. On April 3rd, the violation notice arrived. 6 citations. Manure storage facility lacks adequate concrete containment. Potential runoff violation. Milking parlor floor drainage. Insufficient per current standards. Bulk tank cooling system temperature variance exceeds 0.5 degrees allowable margin. Calf housing ventilation below recommended cubic feet per minute. Feed storage building roof deterioration presents contamination risk. General facility maintenance deficiencies noted, repairs required. Each violation came with a deadline: 60 days for minor issues, 120 days for major infrastructure. Each violation came with potential fines, if not corrected. Dutch sat at the kitchen table reading the notice while Ellen cooked dinner, while his children did homework, while the life he'd built continued around him, oblivious. The repairs would cost somewhere between $75,000 and $125,000. Money he didn't have. Money the bank wouldn't loan him because dairy farms were bad investments now. Everyone knew it. The second inspection came in July. Patricia Chen from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources arrived on July 19th, 1991, driving a green pickup with the state seal on the door. She was 42, efficient, armed with soil testing equipment and water sampling kits. Dutch knew why she was there before she introduced herself. The DNR was cracking down on agricultural runoff, and the Vandermeer farm, with its manure lagoon dating from 1968, was exactly the kind of facility they were targeting. Chen was thorough. She tested soil samples from the fields where Dutch spread manure. She took water samples from the drainage ditch that ran along the south property line. She measured the distance from the lagoon to the nearest creek, calculated storage capacity versus herd size, photographed the earthen berms that contained thousands of gallons of liquid manure. She was polite but firm, explaining that environmental regulations had changed, that what was acceptable 20 years ago wasn't acceptable now. The Dutch would receive a full report within 30 days. The report came August 23rd, 14 violations ranging from minor to severe. The worst: manure storage facility does not meet current containment standards, poses significant risk of groundwater contamination. Immediate corrective action required. Construction of approved concrete storage facility mandatory. Deadline: 180 days from notice date. Estimated cost: $60,000 minimum. Thomas Brennan from the Marathon County Health Department came September 5th. He was 57, a career bureaucrat who'd been inspecting farms since 1976, who remembered when farmers were respected, but who had a job to do and regulations to enforce regardless of personal feelings. He spent 3 hours examining the milking parlor, the equipment, the cleaning procedures. He was especially interested in the bulk tank, the stainless steel reservoir, where milk from 180 cows was stored at 38 degrees until the truck came to collect it twice weekly. Dutch's tank was old, installed in 1974, but it worked perfectly, maintained meticulously, cleaned religiously. But Brennan pointed out small rust spots on external seams, minor temperature fluctuations, recorded in Dutch's own logs, a crack in one of the site glasses. His report, arriving September 27th, cited 7 violations and included a recommendation that the bulk tank be replaced entirely. Cost: $45,000. By October 1st, 1991, Dutch Vandermeer had received inspection reports from 4 different agencies totaling 33 violations. The total cost to achieve full compliance: $237,000. His annual gross income from the dairy operation: $98,000. His annual net income after expenses: $22,000. The math was simple, brutal, final. He couldn't comply. And if he couldn't comply, they'd shut him down. The Vandermeer farm had been born from timber and stubbornness in 1923, when Dutch's grandfather, the first Robert Vandermeer, had purchased 247 acres of cut-over forest land for $800, borrowed from a Dutch immigrant banker in Milwaukee who believed in helping his own people. The land had been logged bare by timber companies, leaving stumps 3 feet across and soil exhausted from decades of pine forest. It wasn't prime farmland. It was what poor immigrants could afford. That first, Robert had spent 3 years pulling stumps with a team of Belgian draft horses, clearing rocks that seemed to grow back each spring, building the original barn with lumber he'd milled himself from trees on the back 40. He'd started with 12 dairy cows purchased on credit, built the herd slowly, survived by selling cream to the local creamery and working winter logging jobs to make payments. By 1930, when the Depression hit and farms across Wisconsin were foreclosing at rates that made newspapers stop printing the auction notices, Robert Vandermeer had paid off his land. That fact, that singular achievement of owning the land free and clear, had saved the family when milk prices collapsed and banks failed. They'd been poor, eating oatmeal for dinner, wearing patched clothes, but the land was theirs. Nobody could take it. Robert's son, Dutch's father John, had inherited the farm in 1948 after his father died of a heart attack at age 57, worn out from 25 years of labor that would have killed weaker men. John had modernized carefully, taking small loans he knew he could repay, installing the first milking machines in 1952, building a new barn in 1959, expanding the herd to 120 cows by 1965. He'd raised Dutch and his sister Marie, teaching them that the farm wasn't just a business. It was a covenant with the past, a responsibility to those who'd come before and those who'd come after. John Vandermeer had died in April 1987 at age 68, collapsing in the milking parlor from a massive stroke, dying before the ambulance could navigate the 3 miles of county roads from town. His last words, spoken to Dutch as his son held him on the concrete floor while cows waited patiently to be milked, were simple and devastating. "Don't let it go. Promise me." Dutch had promised, had looked into his father's eyes and sworn that the Vandermeer farm would continue, would pass to Bobby or Tommy or whoever wanted it, would remain in the family that had bled for it across 3 generations. That promise had seemed easy then, when milk prices were stable and regulations were reasonable. Dutch went to the bank first before the desperation fully set in, still believing the system might work if he just explained properly. First National Bank of Wausau, where the Vandermeer family had done business since 1924, where Dutch's grandfather had made his first deposit of $17 from selling cream, where 3 generations of loan payments had been made on time every time. He met with Michael Thorson, the agricultural loan officer, on October 2, 1991. Thorson was 48, 3rd-generation Wausau himself, son and grandson of dairy farmers who'd sold out in the 1970s when the economics stopped working. He knew the industry, knew the numbers, knew what Dutch was going to ask before Dutch opened his mouth. Dutch laid out the situation clearly. $237,000 needed for compliance. He had detailed quotes from contractors, specific plans for each upgrade, a timeline showing how he'd phase the work. He explained the violation deadlines, the threatened shutdown, the impossibility of continuing without the repairs. Thorson listened, reviewed Dutch's financial statements, examined 5 years of tax returns showing declining net income despite steady production. He looked at Dutch with something like sympathy and something like pity. "Dutch, I can't loan you money to pour into a losing proposition. Your debt-to-income ratio is already at 73%. Your operation grosses under $100,000 annually. You're asking for a loan worth 2.4 times your annual gross income to comply with regulations that might change again in 3 years." Dutch had expected this, but hearing it still felt like a physical blow. "The farm's been here 70 years. We've never missed a payment. That's got to count for something." "It counts for a lot, personally. But bank policy is clear. Agricultural lending in dairy has been severely restricted since 1989. Corporate headquarters won't approve loans over $50,000 for operations under 200 cows. And honestly, Dutch, even if I could get it approved, you couldn't afford the payments. You'd be bankrupt in 18 months. Dutch tried 2 more banks, Marathon Savings and Loan, where he'd financed his truck in 1986, Community Credit Union, where Ellen had her savings account. The answers were identical, delivered with varying degrees of compassion but absolute finality. No lending institution would finance repairs to keep a small dairy farm compliant with regulations that everyone understood were designed to eliminate small dairy farms. He applied for grants, contacted the Wisconsin Farm Bureau, explored every program mentioned in agricultural extension newsletters. October 10th, 1991, Thursday evening. Temperature had dropped to 31 degrees. First hard frost of the season killing what remained of Ellen's garden, turning pumpkins in the field to mush, making the ground ring hard under boots. Dutch sat alone in the small office attached to the barn, a 10 by 12 room that smelled like motor oil, old paper, and decades of farm records. The office had been his grandfather's, then his father's, now his. 3 generations of Vandermeer men had made decisions in this room, calculated margins, planned futures. The walls were covered with calendars dating back to 1953, each one a historical record of breeding dates, calvings, veterinary visits, the minutiae of farming life. A photograph hung above the desk, black and white, showing Dutch's grandfather standing in front of the original barn in 1925, hand on the shoulder of his first milk cow, face set with determination and pride. Dutch had looked at that photograph 10,000 times, but tonight he really saw it, saw the cost in his grandfather's eyes, the weight of building something from nothing, the responsibility of continuation. On the desk in front of him sat 13 pieces of paper, arranged in chronological order. March 21st, USDA Inspection Report, Gerald Hawkins. July 19th, DNR Inspection Report, Patricia Chen. September 5th, Health Department Inspection Report, Thomas Brennan. And 10 more, accumulated over 7 months, each one signed by a different inspector, each one demanding compliance he couldn't afford, each one threatening the shutdown of everything 3 generations had built. Dutch had a legal pad in front of him, covered with calculations. He'd done and redone, trying to find a mathematical solution that didn't exist. Total compliance cost, $237,000. Available cash, $11,342. Loan approval, $0. Sale value of farm if shut down and forced to auction. Maybe $350,000, which sounded substantial until you subtracted the $128,000 still owed on the mortgage, the $47,000 in operating loans, the back taxes, the equipment loans. Net proceeds, maybe $150,000, split among settling debts and trying to start over at age 47 with no skills beyond dairy farming, in an economy where dairy farming was dying. He'd been sitting in this office since 8 p.m., after evening milking, after dinner with Ellen and Tommy, after checking on the cows, one final time, after Sarah had gone to her room to study, after Ellen had gone to bed, trusting him to find a solution like he'd always found solutions. The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m. In 4 hours, he'd need to start morning milking. Monday, October 14th, 1991, 9:43 a.m. Temperature had climbed to 48 degrees under pale October sunlight that did nothing to warm the wind coming across the fields. Gerald Hawkins pulled his white government sedan into the Vandermeer farmyard, exactly on time for the follow-up inspection he'd scheduled by certified letter 2 weeks prior. This was his second visit, meant to verify that Dutch had made progress on the 6 violations cited in March. The compliance was being achieved according to the timeline. Hawkins was 34 years old, married, 2 children ages 6 and 8, living in Stevens Point, 47 miles south. He'd grown up in suburban Milwaukee, studied agricultural science at UW-Madison, joined the USDA in 1983 with genuine idealism about improving food safety and farming practices. 8 years of inspecting farms had worn that idealism down to procedure and paperwork. But he wasn't cruel, wasn't trying to destroy anyone. He was doing his job, following regulations, checking boxes on forms that went to supervisors who checked more boxes that went to Washington, where bureaucrats who'd never seen a dairy farm made policy. Dutch met him at the barn, same as in March, shook his hand with those massive damaged hands, showed no emotion. "Morning, Mr. Hawkins. Come to see if I've spent money I don't have?" Hawkins smiled uncomfortably. "Just here to check on progress, Mr. Vandermeer. I understand these upgrades are expensive, but the regulations are clear. Has the manure storage facility been addressed? No. The milking parlor drainage? No. The bulk tank cooling variants? No." Hawkins looked down at his clipboard, made notations. "Mr. Vandermeer, you understand that without demonstrated progress toward compliance, I'm required to recommend your permit be suspended. That means you won't be able to sell milk. That effectively shuts down your operation." "I understand perfectly." Dutch's voice was flat, empty. "The system's designed to shut down farms like mine. You're just the instrument." "I'm trying to help ensure food safety, sir." "You're killing my family's farm. 70 years of work, gone because of regulations written by people who've never milked a cow." Hawkins wanted to argue, wanted to explain that regulations existed for good reasons, that modernization was necessary, that consumer safety mattered. But he'd had this conversation with dozens of farmers, and it never changed anything. "I need to inspect the manure lagoon. Document current conditions for my report." Dutch nodded slowly. "It's out back. I'll show you." They walked together across the farmyard, past the main barn where 180 cows were bedded, past the equipment shed, past the silo, toward the manure storage lagoon at the rear of the property. The manure lagoon sat in a depression Dutch's father had excavated in 1968, roughly 100 feet long by 60 feet wide by 12 feet deep, lined with compacted clay and ringed by earthen berms. It held approximately 400,000 gallons of liquid manure, the accumulated waste from 180 cows, producing about 15 gallons per animal per day. The lagoon was a necessary evil of dairy farming, a temporary storage solution before manure was pumped out and spread on fields as fertilizer. The smell was overwhelming if you weren't used to it, a thick ammonia reek, mixed with methane and decomposition, strong enough to make eyes water. But farmers stopped noticing after a while, the same way they stopped noticing the smell of silage or the constant low-level noise of cattle. Dutch walked Hawkins around the perimeter, showing him the berms, the clay lining, the pump-out system. Hawkins took photographs, made notes, measured depths and distances. He stepped carefully, aware that the ground near the edges could be unstable, that falling into a manure lagoon meant drowning in liquid waste, a death so horrible that farm safety manuals dedicated entire sections to lagoon safety protocols. Mr. Vandermeer, the DNR is correct that this facility doesn't meet current standards. You need concrete containment, proper agitation systems, methane capture. The cost estimate you received, $60,000. That's actually quite reasonable for a facility this size. Dutch stood 3 feet behind Hawkins, watching the inspector photograph his family's lagoon, document its inadequacy, prepare the report that would contribute to shutting them down. He felt nothing. Just a vast cold emptiness where emotion should have been. The same emptiness he'd felt in the barn office 3 nights ago, when he'd crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. "Can I show you something?" Dutch said. "There's a section over here where the berms eroded. Want to make sure you document everything." Hawkins followed, trusting, clipboard in hand, camera hanging from his neck. Dutch led him to the northeast corner where the berm did show some erosion, where the slope was steeper, where the edge was less stable. Hawkins stepped closer, leaning forward to examine the damage, making notes. Dutch moved with the speed and strength of a man who'd thrown hay bales and wrestled cattle for 30 years. 1 step forward, both hands on Hawkins's back, a hard shove that sent the inspector stumbling forward, arms windmilling, clipboard flying, falling face first into 400,000 gallons of liquid manure 12 feet below. The splash was enormous, brown-black waste erupting upward. Hawkins surfaced immediately, gasping, choking, eyes wide with shock and terror, treading in thick liquid that made swimming nearly impossible. "Help! Mr. Vandermeer, please!" Dutch stood on the berm, looking down, face expressionless. "You were going to shut me down, take everything my grandfather built, destroy my family." Ellen Vandermeer woke at 5:30 a.m. on Tuesday, October 15th, same as every morning for 21 years of marriage. The bed beside her was already empty, already cold. Dutch had been up since 3:30 for morning milking, maintaining the routine that governed their lives with absolute regularity. She lay there for a moment listening to the house settle, the old furnace kicking on against the October chill, the sound of wind moving through the oak tree outside their bedroom window. Downstairs, she made breakfast the way she'd done 7,000 times before. Oatmeal on the stove, coffee percolating, toast in the oven because the toaster had broken in August and they couldn't afford to replace it. Small economies that had become normal, necessary. Tommy came down at 6:15, 14 years old, hair sticking up, wearing the same Packers sweatshirt he'd worn 3 days running. He ate quickly, barely talking, the way teenage boys do, then headed out to help Dutch with the tail end of morning chores before the school bus came at 7:20. Sarah appeared at 6:45:17, immaculately put together despite the early hour, already dressed for school, makeup perfect, carrying textbooks for her AP classes. She was brilliant, destined for Marquette University in Milwaukee, destined to escape this farm and this life. And Ellen was grateful for that, even as it broke her heart. "Dad up early again?" Sarah asked, pouring coffee. "Same as always, honey." Ellen cracked eggs into a pan, scrambled them with cheese they made last longer by using less than the recipe called for. "He seems stressed lately, more than usual." Sarah had always been perceptive, reading emotions other people tried to hide. Ellen kept her face neutral. "Just farm stuff. Regulations, paperwork, nothing for you to worry about." But Sarah's eyes said she didn't believe it, said she'd noticed her father's silences growing longer, noticed the tension in the house like static before a storm, noticed things a 17-year-old shouldn't have to notice. She didn't push, just drank her coffee and ate her eggs and gathered her books for another day of being the smartest kid at Wausau East High School, earning scholarships that would carry her away from this place. Dutch came in at 7 o'clock, boots left on the porch, hands washed, but still carrying the smell of the barn, that combination of hay and cow and work that no amount of soap could completely remove. He kissed Ellen on the cheek, routine and automatic, poured coffee, sat at the table. Tommy rushed in behind him, grabbed toast, headed for the door as the school bus rumbled down their long driveway. Sarah followed, pausing to hug her father, a gesture that seemed to surprise him, his arms coming up slowly to return the embrace. "Love you, Dad." "Love you too, sweetheart. Do good in school." Then they were gone, and Ellen and Dutch sat alone in the kitchen. Marathon County Sheriff Dale Ruskin received the first missing person report at 2:17 p.m. on Tuesday, October 15th. Gerald Hawkins's wife, Jennifer, calling from Stevens Point, voice tight with worry that was trying not to become panic. Her husband had left Monday morning for a routine farm inspection, should have been home by 6 p.m., hadn't called, hadn't come home, wasn't answering his pager. His car wasn't at the office. His supervisor hadn't heard from him. He'd never done this before, never just disappeared, and she had 2 children asking where Daddy was. Ruskin was 53 years old, sheriff of Marathon County for 11 years, a career in law enforcement that had started as a deputy in 1962. He'd seen deaths from farming accidents, domestic violence, car crashes on icy roads, the occasional hunting incident. Marathon County wasn't a high-crime area. They'd had 2 murders in his entire tenure, both domestic situations, both solved within 48 hours. Missing persons were rare and usually resolved quickly. Teenagers running away, elderly folks with dementia wandering off, people who turned up embarrassed within a day. But something about Jennifer Hawkins's voice, the specific wrongness of a federal inspector vanishing between farm visits, made Ruskin's instincts wake up. "Mrs. Hawkins, what farm was your husband visiting Monday?" "I have his schedule here. Let me find it." Papers rustling. Vandermeer Dairy Farm, Rural Route 2, Rietbrock. He had a 9 a.m. appointment. Ruskin wrote down the information, promised to investigate immediately, called Deputy Tom Kessler to accompany him. They drove the 17 miles to the Vandermeer farm, pulled into the yard at 3:45 p.m. Dutch was in the equipment shed, working on a tractor that had thrown a belt, hands black with grease, looking up as the sheriff's vehicle approached. He stood slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, walked out to meet them. Ruskin had known Dutch Vandermeer for 20 years. Not well, but the way you know people in rural communities, seeing them at the feed mill, at town meetings, at high school basketball games. Solid guy, hard worker, never any trouble. "Afternoon, Dutch. Got a minute?" "Sure, Sheriff. What's this about?" USDA inspector named Gerald Hawkins was scheduled to visit your farm yesterday morning. His wife reported him missing this afternoon. Did he make it out? "Here?" Dutch's face showed nothing, just mild concern. "Yeah, he was here. Showed up right at 9, did his inspection, left around 10:30. Seemed fine." "He never made it home, Dutch. Never checked in with his office. You were the last scheduled stop on his route." "That's concerning. Hope he's all right. Maybe car trouble? These county roads can be rough." Ruskin nodded, scanning the farmyard, the barns, the fields beyond. Wednesday, October 16th, 9:23 a.m. Patricia Chen pulled her green DNR truck into the Vandermeer farmyard for an unscheduled follow-up inspection. She'd heard through agency communications that a USDA inspector had gone missing after visiting this farm, that local law enforcement was investigating. But she had her own compliance deadlines to enforce and a full schedule of farms to inspect. Besides, one missing inspector didn't necessarily mean anything suspicious. People had accidents, personal crises, medical emergencies. Chen was 42 years old, divorced, no children, dedicated to her work with the intensity of someone who'd fought to be taken seriously in a male-dominated field. Environmental protection mattered. Agricultural runoff was a real problem. Farmers needed to comply, period. She'd given Dutch Vandermeer 180 days to build proper manure storage. That deadline was approaching, and she needed to document current conditions for the enforcement action that would inevitably follow non-compliance. Dutch met her at the barn. Same calm demeanor he'd shown the sheriff yesterday. Same weathered face showing nothing. "Ms. Chen, wasn't expecting you today." "Unscheduled compliance check, Mr. Vandermeer. I need to see the manure storage facility again. Verify that no progress has been made so I can finalize my recommendation for enforcement action." "No progress has been made. I've been clear about that from the start. Can't afford the upgrades you're requiring." Chen pulled on rubber boots, grabbed her testing kit and camera. "That's not my concern, Mr. Vandermeer. My concern is environmental protection. Your facility is a contamination risk." They walked toward the lagoon, same route Dutch had taken with Hawkins 2 days earlier, same careful approach to the earthen berms, same procedures she'd followed in July. Chen was thorough, professional, taking water samples from the lagoon's edge, measuring depths, photographing everything. She was so focused on documentation that she didn't notice Dutch positioning himself behind her, didn't register the danger until his hands hit her back, and she was falling, camera flying, arms reaching for something that wasn't there. The impact with the liquid manure drove the air from her lungs. She surfaced, choking, gasping, trying to scream, but inhaling waste instead, thick and suffocating. Chen was a strong swimmer, had lifeguarded in college, but swimming in manure was different. The viscosity wrong, the smell overwhelming, panic making her movements jerky and inefficient. She treaded desperately, looking up at Dutch, standing on the berm 12 feet above, backlit by pale morning sun. "Please, help me, I can't." Her head went under, came back up, under again. Dutch watched for 11 minutes, same as with Hawkins, until Patricia Chen's movement slowed, stopped, until she floated face down in the waist, until he was certain. Then he walked back to the barn. Thursday, October 17th, 1:47 a.m. Ellen Vandermeer woke to find Dutch's side of the bed empty again. Not unusual, given his early schedule, but something felt wrong. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that meant something was missing from the usual pattern. She lay there trying to identify what had changed, what her subconscious had noticed that her conscious mind hadn't processed. Then she realized, no sound from the barn. By 1:45, Dutch should be starting prep for morning milking, lights on in the milking parlor, equipment running, the familiar industrial hum that had been the soundtrack of their marriage. Silence meant something was wrong with the routine, and the routine was everything. Ellen got up, pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt over her nightgown, slipped into boots, walked out into October darkness, so complete it felt solid. Temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, frost forming on everything, her breath visible in clouds. The barn was dark, completely dark, no lights anywhere. Ellen felt fear beginning to knot in her stomach, irrational scenarios flooding her mind. Dutch collapsed, heart attack like his father, lying in the milking parlor waiting for help. She hurried across the yard, pushed through the barn door, flipped the light switches. The fluorescent tubes flickered to life, revealing 180 cows in their stanchions, calm and patient, waiting for milking that was now 2 hours late. But no Dutch. Ellen moved through the barn systematically, checking the milking parlor, the equipment room, the feed storage, calling his name, hearing only cows shifting and the wind against the barn walls. Then she saw light under the door of the office, the small room Dutch used for paperwork, for privacy, for thinking. She opened the door and found him sitting at the desk, still wearing his work clothes from yesterday, unshaven, eyes red from lack of sleep, surrounded by papers spread across every surface, and among those papers, things that didn't make sense. Inspection reports, she recognized those, violations, and compliance demands they'd discussed. But also soggy documents, water-damaged brown stains that looked like, smelled like, manure. And in the trash can beside the desk, Dutch's work boots, covered in dried waste, the laces cut because they'd been too filthy to untie. And on the desk, a list written in Dutch's precise handwriting, 13 names, 11 of them crossed out with red pen. Ellen stood in the doorway, feeling the world tilt, feeling everything she'd believed about her husband, her life, her reality, start to crack like ice on a spring pond. Dutch looked up, saw her, showed no surprise. "Ellen, what is this?" Her voice barely functioned. "What are these papers? Why are there 11 names crossed off? Dutch, what have you done?" Dutch watched his wife from behind the scarred oak desk as she stood frozen in the doorway of the barn office. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sickly pallor across the room, flattening color and warmth alike. Ellen's face looked drained, as if the life had been siphoned out of her. Her eyes, moving slowly from the stack of soggy inspection reports laid out like evidence exhibits, to the ruined boots crusted with dried slurry near the wall, and finally to the single sheet of paper lying between them. The list. 11 names, each one crossed through with thick red lines, ink pressed hard enough to scar the page. 21 years of marriage, 21 years of shared meals, shared worries, shared dreams built around the slow rhythms of dairy life, and now she was staring at something that felt alien. Dutch realized, not for the first time, that he should have hidden everything better. He should have burned the documents, buried the boots, memorized the names, and destroyed the paper. A smarter man would have left no trace, but some part of him, buried beneath exhaustion and resentment and years of quiet panic, wanted her to see it. Wanted someone to understand the calculations he had made, the brutal arithmetic of survival. "I did what I had to do," Dutch said at last. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, stripped of warmth, stripped of hesitation. It was the voice of a man who had passed beyond fear and guilt into something colder, a place where emotion had been replaced by logic. Ellen flinched at the sound. She stepped into the office slowly, her legs unsteady, one hand reaching for the desk as if the ground itself might give way beneath her. "Those people," Dutch continued, nodding toward the list, "every one of them, they were going to take everything. 70 years of work, 3 generations, gone. All because of regulations written by people who've never milked a cow, never watched a calf struggle to stand in the cold." Ellen picked up the paper with trembling hands. She read the names aloud in her head, each one a nail driven deeper into the coffin of the life she thought she knew. Gerald Hawkins crossed out. Patricia Chen crossed out. Thomas Brennan crossed out. 8 more names she barely recognized, each one marked with finality. At the bottom, 2 names remained untouched, waiting. Michael Foster, Susan Dalton. "You killed them," she whispered. Her voice cracked, the words barely surviving the journey from her throat to the air between them. "You killed 11 people." Dutch met her gaze without blinking. 13, when I'm finished." The certainty in his tone made her recoil as if struck. "Foster's coming this morning," he said calmly. 8 o'clock. Dalton tomorrow. Then it's done." "Dutch, this is insanity," Ellen said, backing away from the desk. "This is murder. These people had families, children. They were just doing their jobs. Their jobs were destroying us," he snapped, standing abruptly, his chair scraping harshly across the concrete floor. For the first time, anger broke through the flatness, raw and volcanic. Every inspection, every violation, every deadline they knew we couldn't meet. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were eliminating farms like ours, and they didn't care. Ellen shook her head, tears spilling freely now. So your answer was to drown them in the manure lagoon? To turn our land into a grave? I didn't hide them, Dutch said, his voice dropping back into that chilling calm. They're in the lagoon. When the inspections stop, when we can finally farm in peace, I'll pump it out like every spring, spread it on the fields. They'll become fertilizer, at least then they'll be useful. The words made Ellen gag. She tasted bile, horror flooding her senses, washing away any remaining illusion that the man she loved still existed. She thought of the children sleeping in the house 60 yards away, Sarah poring over college acceptance letters, Tommy talking endlessly about taking over the farm one day, Bobby away in Madison, blissfully unaware that his childhood home had become something monstrous. This ends now, Ellen said, her voice shaking but firm. I won't let you do this. Dutch looked past her, toward the fields beyond the office window, toward the land he believed he was saving. You don't get a say, he replied. Not anymore. Sheriff Dale Ruskin stared at the large map pinned to the wall of his office, the kind used for hunting season or school geography fairs, now repurposed into something grim. The borders of Marathon County were covered in a web of colored pushpins and annotated notes, each marking the last confirmed sighting of someone who had since vanished. Not runaways, not fugitives, but professionals, inspectors. 11 of them, all gone within the span of 72 hours. Government employees, most from the Department of Agriculture, some from Environmental Protection, a few from local agencies, all on official business, all last seen heading to dairy farms. Ruskin leaned back in his creaky chair, the weight of it pressing into his spine. A slow, gnawing fear had begun to creep under his skin. Not the kind that came from facing danger directly, but the kind that came from realizing you were already too late. The timeline was now undeniable. Gerald Hawkins, a field inspector with the USDA, was last seen Monday morning heading to Vandermeer Farm. Patricia Chen from the DNR had a Wednesday morning inspection scheduled for the same location. Thomas Brennan of the County Health Department had been preparing a follow-up visit on Tuesday to a farm near Rietbrock. None of them came home. Ruskin had spent all day Wednesday driving from one family to another, sitting at kitchen tables, beneath faded photographs and crocheted Bible verses, asking about last conversations, last text messages, last known intentions. Every answer pointed to the same chilling conclusion. The pattern was too exact, too deliberate. What disturbed him more was the proximity. 3 of the farms where the inspectors had been scheduled were within a 5-mile radius, all of them small, independently owned, all struggling under mounting compliance violations, all desperately trying to survive. A name kept coming up: Vandermeer. Dutch Vandermeer's name appeared in inspection notes, in complaint forms, in handwritten messages. The most damning piece came late Wednesday evening when Michael Patterson, an environmental protection specialist, was confirmed as the latest to vanish. His vehicle had been found abandoned along a narrow county road, just 2 miles south of the Henderson dairy farm. Inside, Patterson's clipboard still sat on the passenger seat. Written at the top, Henderson Dairy, Initial Violation Review. But scribbled underneath, in Patterson's own handwriting, was a note that now read like a warning from beyond the grave. Vandermeer retaliation concern, discuss with Dalton. Then there was Dale Henderson himself. The farmer had been discovered dead inside his own grain silo, drowned in a slurry of wet feed and water. The circumstances were almost theatrical. No forced entry, no witnesses, no blood. Just a dead man sealed inside his own equipment. A farmer silenced before he could speak. Ruskin's gut told him that the deaths were not only connected, they were engineered, calculated. Someone was cleaning house. And the name Vandermeer was always nearby. Deputy Tom Kessler appeared in the open doorway, his expression lined with tension. "Sheriff, we got another one." Ruskin didn't move, didn't speak. He just closed his eyes briefly. "Who?" "Susan Dalton," Kessler replied, voice low. "USDA Regional Supervisor. She had a scheduled visit with Vandermeer this morning. 8 o'clock, didn't show. Her secretary called it in when she missed a 9:30 conference call." Ruskin sat up straight. "Where was she last seen?" "Her car was found pulled over on County Road K," Kessler said. 3 miles from Vandermeer's place, keys still in the ignition. No sign of a struggle, no sign of Dalton. It's like she vanished into thin air. The sheriff rose from his chair, already grabbing his service weapon, voice steady. "Call in backup state police, DNR rangers, anyone with a badge and a gun. We're bringing Dutch Vandermeer in before someone else disappears." By 10:43 that morning, 8 vehicles were parked just off the gravel drive leading to the Vandermeer farm. Officers, state and local, moved in tactical formation across the neatly mowed grass, rifles lowered but ready. Their approach was cautious, deliberate. No one underestimated a man who had, if their worst fears were correct, murdered at least a dozen people without leaving behind a single scream, a single witness, a single piece of physical evidence. The farm itself looked serene. The October sunlight was pale and filtered through thin clouds. Rows of hay bales stood stacked along the perimeter. Chickens pecked at the dirt near the old barn. A wind chime clinked lazily on the porch. It was the kind of scene that could have been pulled from a Midwest tourism brochure. Peaceful, pastoral, timeless. But underneath the topsoil of that illusion, Sheriff Ruskin believed, was a nightmare waiting to be uncovered. And he was done waiting. The trial of Robert Dutch Vandermeer began in April 1992 in a Madison courtroom after a change of venue made it clear that justice could not be fairly administered in Marathon County. The community there was too close, too intertwined with the rhythms of dairy farming and the quiet resentments that had been building for decades. Finding 12 jurors who did not already have a fixed opinion about Dutch Vandermeer proved impossible. He was either a monster beyond comprehension or a man who had done the unthinkable to protect what generations before him had built. From the first day, the courtroom was packed. Farmers in worn jackets sat beside families of the victims, their grief visible in the set of their shoulders and the tightness around their eyes. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks open, pens poised, aware they were witnessing a case that would ripple far beyond the state of Wisconsin. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the charges with brutal clarity. 13 counts of first-degree murder, 13 deliberate killings, 13 human beings drowned in a manure lagoon beneath the pretense of routine farm operations. They presented recordings of Dutch's confessions, made calmly and without an attorney present. In them, he spoke with chilling precision, detailing how each inspector had been lured, restrained, and submerged. There was no trembling in his voice, no hesitation, only justification. The recovery of the bodies had taken 3 days in October. The process was so horrific that 2 forensic technicians later required psychological counseling. One described the lagoon as a mass grave disguised as fertilizer. Each body was identified, cataloged, and returned to families, forever changed. The prosecution read the names aloud. Gerald Hawkins, aged 34, married, father of 2 young children. Patricia Chen, aged 42, a dedicated environmental scientist who believed deeply in protecting public health. Thomas Brennan, aged 57, a career public servant who had spent decades ensuring safety standards were upheld. Michael Foster, who arrived at the Vandermeer farm on Thursday morning at 8 o'clock and never left. Susan Dalton, intercepted on County Road K after accepting help from a farmer she trusted, unaware she was walking toward her death. 8 more followed. 8 lives reduced to evidence. The defense attempted a different story. They argued extreme emotional disturbance, calling experts in agricultural economics to explain the devastation wrought by regulatory pressure. Psychologists testified about the mental toll of generational farm loss, about the crushing despair that came from watching 70 years of work erased by paperwork and deadlines impossible to meet. They painted Dutch as a fundamentally good man, pushed beyond reason by a system that valued compliance over humanity. But the prosecution dismantled that narrative piece by piece. Emotional disturbance, they argued, does not involve detailed lists with names crossed out in red ink. It does not involve scheduling murders across multiple days. It does not involve calmly milking cows, eating dinner with family, and tucking children into bed while 13 bodies decomposed beneath your land. This was not madness, this was choice. Ellen Vandermeer took the stand on the 7th day of testimony. She looked smaller than many remembered, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She spoke about finding the list, about the way Dutch had spoken without emotion, about realizing the man she had shared a life with was someone she no longer recognized. When asked whether she had ever suspected her husband was capable of violence, she broke down completely, sobbing that she had lived with a stranger, that 21 years of marriage felt like a lie she could never escape. She filed for divorce the day Dutch was arrested. She moved the children to her sister's home in Green Bay and began the slow, painful process of building a new life from the wreckage. Dutch himself remained expressionless throughout the proceedings. He reacted to photographs of the lagoon, to testimony from grieving families, to the reading of autopsy reports with the same blank detachment. The only time his composure cracked was when his youngest son, Bobby, testified. Bobby spoke about growing up on the farm, about the pride Dutch once took in the land, about the grandfather he never knew, but whose legacy defined their family. For a brief moment, Dutch's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something like regret, or perhaps simply recognition. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Dutch Vandermeer was sentenced to 13 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, the courtroom remained silent. No cheers, no applause, only the quiet acknowledgement that something irrevocable had occurred, not just 13 deaths, but the collapse of an entire moral boundary. Outside the courthouse, families wept. Farmers stood in small clusters, conflicted, understanding the desperation while recoiling from the outcome. The state of Wisconsin had found its verdict, but the damage ran deeper than any sentence could reach. 33 years have passed since that October in Wisconsin, when 13 government employees were drowned by a dairy farmer who believed that protecting his legacy justified any cost. Time has softened some edges and sharpened others. Buildings have been replaced, roads widened, names forgotten. But the questions raised by what Robert Dutch Vandermeer did have never settled into silence. They linger in court transcripts, in whispered conversations, in the private thoughts of people who still wonder where the line between desperation and evil truly lies. Dutch Vandermeer is 80 years old now. His hair is thin and white, his body bent slightly forward, as if still bracing against Midwest winds that no longer touch him. He serves 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole at a maximum security prison in Portage, Wisconsin. Inside those walls, he is unremarkable. He works quietly in the prison library, reshelving books, repairing damaged spines, teaching inmates how to read. Guards describe him as polite. Other prisoners describe him as distant. He causes no trouble. He speaks rarely. In 2018, a documentary filmmaker was granted permission to interview him. It was the only interview he ever agreed to. Sitting across from the camera in a beige visiting room, Dutch appeared calm, almost serene. When asked whether he regretted what he had done, whether he would make different choices knowing how everything ended, his answer was brief and chilling. "I'd do it the same," he said. "They took everything that mattered. I took what mattered to them. That's justice, even if the law disagrees." Those words have followed the case like a shadow. They are quoted in academic journals, debated in ethics courses, replayed in documentaries and podcasts. Was Dutch Vandermeer a monster, incapable of remorse? Or was he the end result of a system that applied pressure without mercy until something finally broke? Ellen Vandermeer never sought to answer that question publicly. She never gave interviews. She never attended panel discussions or anniversary retrospectives. After the arrest, she left Marathon County and never returned. She built a quiet life in Green Bay, working as a bookkeeper, keeping her head down, avoiding attention. She never remarried. Friends say she carried guilt like a physical weight, blaming herself for not seeing the warning signs, for believing that love and familiarity were the same as safety. Her children scattered, each taking a different path away from the land that had defined their childhood. Bobby became an accountant. He changed his last name to his mother's maiden name and refuses all interview requests. He speaks of his upbringing only in vague terms, never mentioning the farm, never mentioning his father. Those close to him say he is kind, meticulous, and deeply private. Sarah became a mathematics professor at a small college in Minnesota. She publishes under her married name and has spent decades trying to reconcile the father who helped her with algebra homework at the kitchen table with the man who committed 13 murders. In lectures, she sometimes speaks about logic and ethics, about how numbers are neutral, but their applications never are. Tommy, the child who loved farming most, joined the Army at 18. He served 22 years, retired as a sergeant major, and settled in North Carolina. He chose a life structured by rules and accountability, far removed from dairy barns and inspection reports. Those who know him say he has never returned to Wisconsin. The Vandermeer farm did not survive Dutch's attempt to save it. The county seized the land in 1993 to pay legal fees and restitution to the victims' families. A corporate dairy operation purchased it, merged it with neighboring properties, and ran it with industrial efficiency. 8 years later, it was sold again, this time to a development company. Today, the land is a subdivision called Meadowbrook Estates. 47 houses stand where cows once grazed. Children ride bicycles over ground that once concealed 13 bodies. Families mow lawns and host barbecues, unaware of the history beneath their foundations. There is no plaque, no memorial, no marker. Marathon County does not like to remember this story. The families of the victims remember whether the county does or not. Some rebuilt their lives. Some never fully recovered. Jennifer Hawkins, Gerald's widow, raised their children alone. Friends say she never truly healed. She died of cancer in 2009 at the age of 61, though those who knew her privately said she had been dying slowly since the October. Her husband never came home. Susan Dalton's partner established a scholarship fund for environmental science students, determined that Susan's dedication would not be erased by the manner of her death. Patricia Chen's sister became an advocate for inspector safety, testifying before state legislatures about the risks regulatory workers face from those who see them not as people, but as threats. There is one final irony that haunts the story. Dutch Vandermeer believed he was preserving a legacy. Instead, he ensured it would end. His father and grandfather lie buried in a small cemetery near the old farm. A plot sits empty beside them. Dutch will never occupy it. He will be buried in a prison cemetery, separated even in death from the land he killed to protect. And the question remains, unanswered and uncomfortable. When everything you love is taken piece by piece, how far can you go before the justification collapses into something unforgivable? That question, more than the bodies, is what refuses to disappear.